All right. Um, so my name is Justin Nolan. I'm a project director here at the UNC Environmental Finance Center. I'm also our project manager in charge of the P2, EPA P2 or Pollution Prevention Program. Through this program, we have worked with a number of breweries across North Carolina and done a little bit of stuff outside of North Carolina in order to try to help breweries find opportunities to reduce their waste output, reduce their environmental impact. Um, the overall goal of this program is to just reduce source point pollution. So we're trying to find places where pollution is being created and present opportunities to reduce it. Um, our interest in this program primarily comes from the fact that we, as an organization at the Environmental Finance Center, have a tendency to work with small town water utilities who are usually having financial and often engineering problems at the same time. Um, Breweries are, as we'll talk about more as the presentation continues, increasingly popping up in those environments, and they present much needed environmental or economic development for those communities, which is great. But there comes, the trade-off is that, without paying close attention to it, breweries can sometimes have an outsized impact on water systems just because of the effluent that they create. So that was our interest. If we can help the breweries create, do less harm to the water utility, then we can help the water utility stay afloat. Everybody's happy. It's pretty win-win. And through this process, we've learned a whole lot about what some breweries are doing to reduce not only the amount of water they're using, but also the amount of effluent that they put into the water and the types of effluent they put into the water. So we're gonna go ahead and get started here. If I can figure out how to operate this device, there we go. So just want to start with this quotation from the Brewers Association. The continued rapid growth of craft brewing in the United States has stimulated concern for local municipalities, sewer districts as they begin to accept and treat increasing levels of brewery wastewater. So there's two things happening here. Breweries have been very successful. North Carolina is no exception to that. We have a populace that's very interested in the craft brewing scene and very excited about the craft brewing scene. The unintended consequence of that is this, increasingly complex treatment difficulties that breweries are unintentionally creating. And in many situations, breweries have led the charge in altering this behavior. As an industry, they've been very hungry for any sort of technical assistance in regards to altering their methodologies. And so we just wanted to bring some light to those sorts of issues. The goals for the webinar today, we're trying to connect the dots between breweries, water, and the local utilities that serve those breweries, establishing the potential impact of breweries on water in North Carolina due to the rapid spread of the industry, giving some case studies of what a wide array of breweries are doing to reduce their environmental impact. So when I say a wide array, what I mean is I'm going to give you everything from the very, very, very wealthy, successful breweries that have put millions of dollars into um, the work that they're doing because the work that they're doing is interesting and in some cases can be reduced in size and scale and implemented even at smaller breweries. But I'm also going to give you small local breweries that have made some just smart, straightforward decisions that have reduced their water usage. Um, we're going to emphasize the role that simply accurately tracking water can use to be a big part of reducing your water use. So, just what methodologies are you using to track the water use, and the ways in which that can allow you to continuously optimize your processes to reduce water in that way, which doesn't necessarily cost you anything except for the time it takes to do accurate tracking. What's the current relationship? Breweries without a successful implemented water conservation plan can be expected to use as much as or more than 10 gallons of water to produce 1 gallon of beer. I hear different ratios every brewery that I go to. You have everything from, your brewery that's doing nothing in this regard, that's probably somewhere around that 10-gallon mark, to kind of middle of the road places like Wise Man, I believe, told me that they use 8 gallons of water to produce 1 gallon of beer. On all the way down to like Sierra Nevada, which is somewhere in that like 3 to 4 gallons of water to 1 gallon of beer. So there's the whole spectrum existing in North Carolina. In addition to this water usage, breweries r- continuously discharge large volumes of waste beer or wort, yeast, grains into the wastewater system, which d- there's interesting. North Carolina has a complete patchwork of regulatory requirements. So, depending on where your brewery is, you may have absolutely no sort of oversight in terms of what your discharge is, or you may have a whole lot. Um, Out in Wilmington, breweries deal with a self-report system in which they have to take samples and submit them to the water utility, potentially being penalized financially, substantial amounts of money if they don't meet certain criteria. In Raleigh, Trophy, for example, doesn't have very little oversight in terms of what they are allowed to put out. The water utility just isn't very concerned. And like I said, it's a patchwork, so every local area is different. In many cases, um, water utilities don't necessarily have the resources to police accurately, so it can depend. But the outputs that breweries can put out, especially if they're completely unrestrained, unmonitored, can result in very expensive permitting fees for the breweries, as well as straining public treatment capacity, which we're going to talk about more in a second. And lastly, breweries often rely on very, very harsh cleaning mechanisms and harsh cleaning chemicals. These harsh cleaning chemicals can alter wastewater pH, which results in the utility needing to do additional work in order to return that pH to a more manageable level. So again, just all the things that are going on at a brewery, each one of them can have a devastating impact on the water system if they're not being monitored and if they're not being, you know, optimized. And so to kind of dovetail that with other factors that are going on. If you look at craft brewery production in the United States from 2005 until last year, what you see is an almost exclusively upward trend in the amount of breweries that exist. So if you combine this reality and this reality, the takeaway is that ultimately, um, breweries are producing enormous economic benefit. They are creating jobs. They are making money for United States citizens. They're creating tax revenue, but at the same time, because of just the massive increase in them in a very very short period of time, if you look at like just the sheer amount of production that's occurring and what that means for the amount of water that's being used, um, every water utility, every water system in America has had to kind of scramble to varying degrees to adjust to these sorts of differences, especially in rural environments where the brewery may represent one of the only sort of production level, factory level entity within city limits. And to that end, I wanted to point out this map. This is a map from the North Carolina Brewers Guild. It's a little bit outdated. There's significantly more breweries than this now, and these only include the breweries that are in the guild. So if you don't have guild membership, then this isn't going to apply. But what I wanted to stress here is that, obviously you see all that growth, and that's across the entire country. So North Carolina, you kind of see it here as well. There is absolutely concentration of breweries in metropolitan areas. Asheville, obviously, is a very big beer city. Charlotte is increasingly that way. Raleigh, also very big brew city. Winston-Salem has developed, I think they're up to 4 or 5 breweries now, between like Hoots and Foothills, Wise Man, Incendiary, etc. But what I really want to stress here is if you look around, and like I said, this is just the breweries that are managing to be in the guild. So dozens of breweries are left off this list, but a significant number of breweries exist in just straight up rural North Carolina. Um, so again, with the work that our organization, the Environmental Finance Center, does, these breweries often operate in the small towns that are asking us for assistance in terms of keeping their water utilities from going out of, not necessarily going out of business, but from, essentially being potentially losing their charter. These are the water utilities that are, very low income, and they're often in kind of low income areas. And this potentially makes the area very attractive to a small business that's trying to start up, because it means that the costs for buying or renting a very large space to construct a brewery in are reasonable. You can kind of see the like economic dots that lead a brewery to setting up in a rural environment. Not only that, but these are towns that are losing young people at a rapid rate. The demographics of these towns are shifting, and breweries do provide this amazing community resource, this anchoring institution, if you will, that allows the town to hold on to, its young people. It's nice to have like an attractive, interesting, exciting new business and hangout space for local people. And so these towns are really, really, really reluctant to resist any sort of development in this regard. However, they can't always deal with the effluent and the strain that's put on their towns from those breweries, despite really, really, really wanting the breweries to exist. And this kind of pulls us to this reality in which it is pretty essential for breweries and water utilities to have good, open, communicating relationships. This is true on both ends because the brewery cares a lot about the quality of the water that they have access to, and the town cares a lot about the costs and difficulties in treating their water. And there's a lot of symbiosis that can be found between these two things, but it just requires towns, water utilities, to be working hand in hand with the breweries that are starting up in their area. So want to stress this one. So although North Carolina isn't like, the very, very top of the top in terms of breweries, the amount of breweries that exist in it. If you look again, I want to stress that scale. Now that's not like this one, which is for the entire country. This is just for North Carolina. The number of craft breweries operating per year, just from 2011 to 2023, has gone from, right around 50 to over 400, which is great. Again, from an economic perspective, you look at the economic impact, um, it's huge. It's 10th in the country. But it is also that, the production conversation is also really, really critical to have. Again, if we think about that's 892,627 barrels of craft beer being produced, and we know that in many situations, breweries are using between 5 and 10 barrels of water. You can do gallons to gallons or barrels to barrels, but whichever. To produce that, the amount of gallons of water to create 900-ish thousand barrels of craft beer is absurd. I mean, it's a very, very large amount. And if every brewery can just reduce the amount of water they're using by a single gallon per gallon of beer, again, the impact is enormous just because of the sheer economies of scale that are at work in this particular context. So it is critical to think about. Multiple things to consider here. So part of the issue is, and when I start talking about case studies, you're going to see this really come up. A lot of the reason breweries don't necessarily always think about water as a cost is because in America, we have a tendency to bill water at a rate that's much cheaper than water is actually. So, in other words, we do everything we can from an economic development perspective to keep water cheap. Towns want to have a high capacity for the water treatment, and they want to charge, especially businesses, as little as they can so they can draw the businesses to their area. This means that water utilities have to run very, very, very light. They have to run very lean, because they are doing everything they can to charge as little as possible, both because of affordability issues for their actual residential citizens, but also because, like I said, they're trying to incentivize breweries and other big, large industrial scale customers to come to their area. Um, So if you're a brewery, um, water isn't necessarily even on the forefront of your mind in terms of the amount that you're using, because you're not really being punished economically for using more than you need to. And so we start talking about return on investment for some of these changes. And in certain cases, because water is so cheap, the return on investment can be too many years. The time to pay off the cost of increasing. And that is why, and I'm going to go back a little bit. That is why I want to stress this fourth bullet, because if if you as a brewery are looking at this and saying, well, I would like to use less water, but I don't want to spend any money on any of the sort of like fancy, expensive technological changes that I could make in my brewery because the time it would take to pay off just doesn't, the math doesn't make any sense. That's a fair statement, especially for a small brewery that doesn't, isn't producing enormous amounts of beer every year. And that's why the idea of just being very diligent with the amount that you're tracking and thinking about easy ways to reduce the amount of water you're using that don't require a technological installation of any kind can be really critical to making the kind of changes that can be really important. Um, so the other side is that, the energy costs, if you've already put in equipment to heat and pump water, you don't necessarily want to replace that. But there is something to be said for, energy is not inexpensive, right? Energy is charged, it can be very expensive. And something as easy as a thermal curtain put in the right place or an HVAC unit that can be programmed to increase heat or cooling at the right times of the brewing cycle can really reduce the amount that you're spending on energy, which is more substantial, easier to really think about sometimes than the water costs, which are under which are cheap. Um, Third, pollution control costs. Now, this is again going to be more applicable to breweries that exist in areas that have sort of punitive um, water utilities, but it's something to think about. What are the wastewater disposal costs that you're dealing with? Are you being penalized for what you're putting in the water? Are there ways to either technological or methodological processes you can implement to reduce, and what is the ROI? What is the amount of time that that will take? And then lastly, the compliance costs. How much are you being, you know, permitted or dealing with permitting issues, dealing with monitoring compliances. Like I said, um, the Wilmington breweries I've talked to are paying $500 every single time that they get dinged for not having the right stuff in their sample, having a too high a pH in their samples that they're submitting to and $500 is a lot for a brewery that's, running, light as it can, trying to make ends meet, trying to pay its employees. $500 is not an insubstantial cost. And we start really thinking about the math of, what can I do to get these compliance costs down? Is the amount of effort and the technological changes I need to make in order to meet, the compliance requirements of my area might actually be cheaper in the long run than getting dinged continuously. So something to be considering about your own brewery. How much water do you use? When I talk to a lot of breweries, a surprisingly large amount don't actually know. They're not certain, at least. Um, Very few breweries I've spoken to on the small end, and these are not the larger breweries I've spoken with, but your breweries that are small batch, 1 to 2 employees, you know, um, they're not necessarily formally tracking water, and that's partially because of the number of hats that an individual brewer is wearing. But it becomes very difficult to really think intentionally about what your brewery is doing and what your brewery can do if you're not tracking the amount of water you're using. And that could be as easy as a meter installed in the right place, or some of my breweries are using like tracking systems. They have sheets that they fill out. They have SOPs that are specifically designed to reduce water and to track how much water they're using. And it's all in the service of determining what are their trends. When do we use more water? Under what circumstances do we use more water? Is that something we can change? Um, if so, how do we do it? Is it going to require very much money? Like all of these things are only really doable if you can start from a baseline of how much water are we actually using. Um, Thinking about what the largest challenges are helps you determine how to fix it. So if it's a funding challenge, then, potentially you start looking at grant funding. There is grant funding that exists for environmental changes that breweries want to make, or really any factory level business. Is it an implementation thing? You don't understand like how to do it, in which case the huge number of case studies exist. If you look around the National Brewers Association, North Carolina's Brewers Association, just the general web at large, there's a lot of information out there that looks at implementation. There are also a number of experts that, in many situations, will work with breweries free of charge to help look at implementation processes. And one thing I've also noticed is breweries who have been successful in implementing uh, the things that they've done to improve their breweries to reduce their water impact are often so excited to tell other people about what they've done and to share that information. So if it's an implementation issue, it may be as simple as reaching out to somebody who's done it successfully and asking them what they did. Um, One thing I've noticed through our first round of P2 is that one of our big failures in this round of P2 is that we contracted pure engineers to do some of our auditing. And sometimes brewers and engineers don't speak the same language because brewers speak the language of, what goes on day to day at a brewery, and engineers speak the language of efficiency. And those two things don't always match up. So finding someone who speaks the same language as you, who understands the ins and outs of your brewery in the context of your brewery can be a huge help in figuring out how to navigate implementation of any sort of water process. And then lastly, the question, is the greatest challenge just effort? And when I say effort, I mean, have you thought about doing it? Um, have you started formally tracking water use? Have you started formally tracking trends? How much effort do you have time to put into it? Again, some of our breweries that can do the could have the biggest impacts in small communities are breweries that are being run by one or two people, and so trying to figure out where the time's going to come from and how possible is there sort of efficient way to track what you're doing so that you don't have to add a huge amount to your workload. Those sorts of considerations are very, very critical. And then lastly, how does your brewery handle its wastewater? Are there opportunities to alter what is going into the wastewater? Are there organizations that are interested in your wastewater? And I want to come back to that one, but there is kind of a revolution happening right now where increasingly water utilities are realizing that some of the effluent that breweries are putting out can be used directly in wastewater treatment. So, potentially those opportunities exist for your brewery, and it's as simple as reaching out to the utility and determining what they're doing, what they're trying. So, this is the basic gist of the thoughts I want to throw out. I want to stress to the brewery community at large. I know this sort of process can seem really daunting, um, but again, I do think that a lot of breweries can really, really start optimizing if they just get really intentional with the way that they're tracking how much water they're using, and always having a really strong handle on, as precise as possible how much water they're using is the first step. So what I want to do now is I want to transition into some case studies on water reduction. We're going to start big. We're going to start pie in the sky, talking about some breweries that are legends in this community. And then we're going to shift into some local heroes that are doing good stuff, that have worked with our P2 program and who are doing some, very simple, smart things to reduce the amount of water that they're using that can be implemented by anybody. So starting out with Bells. Bells is in Michigan. So the one thing I stress, I want to go back to something I said earlier about thinking about the context of where you live, and the way that the context of where you live can drive um, your kind of incentive to do this water work, and the raw material costs, water being cheap. So Bell's exists in Michigan, and they have a very, very, very close relationship with the water that they use. They are more than some other breweries, probably more involved in keeping their water clean. They had a pretty large legal battle with significant polluters, and I do think that that sort of relationship with water that they've built kind of creates a company culture which normalizes the extreme amount of work that they've done to really have a big impact in the water space. Um, so as far as tracking water, so they use the extensive use of submeters. They have submeters in their brew house. They have submeters in their cellar. They have submeters in their bottle and kegging lines. So at every step of their process, if you were to do a process map for Bell's, they are tracking how much water is being used in every part of their process. As far as utilizing technology, they've created this clean in place system, which has automated and minimized the amount of water needed specifically to clean brewery tanks. Um, they have implemented a filter vacuum pump, which is reducing the amount of wastewater used to 1/8 of where they were before, which is where a lot of that annual result is coming from. And one of the craziest things that Bell's does, which is not feasible for 99% of breweries, but is very, very cool and very, very worthy of talking about, is they have implemented their own wastewater treatment facility on site, which is referred to as the Cube. And I know that, a couple of North Carolina breweries have looked into doing wastewater treatment facilities on site. A lot of times, this is going to be your huge brewery. So again, this is not something I'm saying is reasonable for a small brewery, but it's a very interesting process. The cube is a marvel, and it removes suspended solids and BOD, which are two of the heaviest hitting effluents that ordinarily the water utility would have to deal with, and it converts them into methane, which then is used to power the wastewater treatment facility itself. Which is very cool. So they are not only removing things from their process, they're turning it into energy. They're saving roughly 2,380,000 gallons of water annually. And again, a lot of that's coming from that clean in place system and that filter vacuum pump. Um, Really cool. Bell's water use fluctuates, as they'll admit themselves. It can fluctuate from 4.3 to 5.4, but their aim is a 4.5 volume to volume ratio as their standard, which is admirable considering the scale of production. Then Sierra Nevada, obviously North Carolina big, but also Chico. And I want to stress that, like, again, Sierra Nevada cut its teeth in a context of drought, right? So this is a brewery that, its home base exists in a state that consistently deals with water shortages that aren't necessarily what we normally see in North Carolina. And I do think, again, that has fundamentally altered their company culture. A lot of their creative ideas are coming from um, that desire to basically just bring the methodologies that allow them to thrive in drought riddled California into a water rich state. So, as far as tracking water, they do audits for their plant-wide clean and place system. So again, they haven't. This is a labor issue, but they have the capacity and they have the personnel to audit their own clean and place system with regularity. Which is something that's huge. So they're tracking water again at every step of their thing, from plant sanitation, their cooling towers, across the board. They're looking at how much water is being used in each aspect of their work, which is admirable and definitely like a goal that a lot of breweries should have in mind. Not necessarily feasible for every size of brewery, but something to be thinking about. Um, they utilize a wide variety of technology, but one thing that's really interesting is they've recently retrofitted their keg line in California to run without lubrication or water, which is a huge reduction of water usage. Again, that is a situation where necessity is the mother of invention. Um, California consistently drought riddled, so you're looking for creative solutions. What can we do to reduce our water use? And so they came up with this idea to create this retrofitted keg line, which is very cool. But again, not necessarily something that a North Carolina brewery with plenty of access to water would have spent the time, energy, and money to do. So let's transition to some local stuff and talk about smaller scale, less crazy um, methodologies. So Tarboro Brewing, we've worked extensively with these guys as part of our P2 program. They are very like keep it simple, be smart about stuff, and optimize, optimize, optimize. They use a flow meter or timed usage, so they are either using a flow meter to track the water, or in certain cases, they are simply measuring the amount of gallons used per second or per minute per hour whatever, and then using a tracking times. So we had that hose flowing for that period of time, we had that water flow operating for that period of time. We know that period of time translates to this amount of gallons, and therefore we use this amount of gallons. They use tracking sheets that they created in house to follow trends in brewing and cleaning use. So they are looking at how much they're using in their brewing and how much they're cleaning. They don't necessarily have access to the same level of, technology that the other breweries I've mentioned do. So they don't necessarily have meters installed in every single step of their process. And so instead, they're using these tracking sheets to keep an eye on where their trends are going. They've recently implemented a cold water tank to help during their wort chilling and transfer to fermentation. So instead of running city water to the drain or even recapturing it, sending it to a hot liquor tank, they chill the water first and then they use less as a result. And then they can recapture stuff in the hot liquor tank for brewing purposes. So again, not a super expensive implementation. This isn't a giant clean in place system. This isn't a waterless, assembly line. This is just a cold water tank that they've implemented. So again, there's a real culture at Tarboro of this measure, record, and optimize mentality. They focus on short time bursts of water to ensure that they never have any hoses that are just running water to the drain, which I've seen in a lot of breweries is just a norm. People don't really even think about it again because nobody's going to run up and say, turn that off. You're burning water, you're burning money because water is so cheap. Um, then they create these really rigid SOPs. So they look at when the recommended SOP that industry SOP for an operation requires a lot of water. They try to take precise measurements of the amount of water used and standardize it. So every single time they use the same amount of water, they don't go above or below it. And they determine what's the smallest amount of water they can use for any SOP, and they try to hit it every single time. So again, this isn't expensive in terms of like the implementation of technology. They're not buying fancy things. They're just trying to be very disciplined about their water usage. They're trying to determine how much water should be used, and they're trying to use exactly the same amount every time. And then they're monitoring trends so they make sure that they're not deviating dramatically. And they said, end of the day, a lot can be learned by simply tracking what you are using, then trying to use it less. If you don't measure it, you won't know if you're improving. And that is at the heart of really what I want to stress today is, that is everything. And again, it seems so simple, but between being super busy, being overworked, not necessarily having the right amount of personnel, or just not thinking about it because it's not a huge cost for your brewery, people don't necessarily do the kind of tracking that they could be doing. Um, I also wanted to shout out Mad Mole. Mad Mole's in Wilmington. They've also worked extensively with us. And again, they've got a lot of really interesting methodologies for doing this. So they're, again, in a context, Wilmington is a very environmentally forward town. Their UNC-W University is kind of on the cutting edge in terms of recycling and environmental ideas. They're actively trying to do cleanup of their streams, and there's a very strong culture in Wilmington that even branches out to their local water utility of this sort of environmentalism. As a result, their local utility requires they have water tracking meter for brewing purposes. So this isn't necessarily cleaning purposes, but every bit of water that's being used to do brewing is mandated to be tracked. So they have this again this nice incentive to do the thing that they could already be doing. Um, Tarboro, to just juxtapose it, doesn't have that necessity, is doing it on their own. And so this is really, again, I want to stress like so much of brewery behavior can sometimes just come down to what your local area is requiring you to do. Um, so they're tracking all their brewery purposes, all their brewing water. The technology they're using, they are using a catch basin, which is just used to capture grain and hops and allow for the stabilization of pH, as they said before that gets into the water. They have a really interesting. This is again just common sense, but is something that they realized they could be doing. I believe it was the originally idea of one of their interns, which is just allowing the brewery floor to dry overnight instead of spraying it all down and washing it down the drain, wasting a bunch of water and potentially putting kind of yucky effluents in the water. They sweep. They let the brewery floor dry overnight and then they sweep it out. And yes, that is probably going to require like additional time, might be a little bit more labor intensive, but it uses significantly less water, and it puts significantly fewer things into the water system. They've developed several partnerships to collect all their trub, which means that that doesn't ever have to be washed down the drain, which not only reduces employee wasted time, but it reduces the amount of, again, effluents that are going down the drain. And then they have kind of a similar thing to Tarboro, where they have these optimized, they track and optimize their standard operating procedures, um, so that they can always be improving their cleaning processes and brewing processes, which is where some of these policies, are coming from. Um, Annual result, they probably save 1,500 to 2,000 gallons a month. Again, they're not the size of Sierra Nevada. They're not the size of Bell's. They're not going to produce millions of gallons of change every year. But because North Carolina has so many breweries, if every brewery in North Carolina the size of Mad Mole implemented processes to save 2,000 gallons a month, you can imagine, 400 times 2,000, um, times 12. It's a substantial impact. I also wanted to do a couple of case studies on wastewater pre-treatment. Just some interesting stuff. Stone Brewing Company in Escondido, California. These guys, again, this is a pie in the sky. But I just wanted to point out that this sort of technology is being implemented. People are doing some kind of experimental stuff, um, increasingly, working with their city standards in order to really create positive impacts for everybody involved. And at this point, their membrane bioreactor that they've implemented is so big, it's so successful that it's pretty, the wastewater that they're producing is almost ready, like almost of a level that it could just be immediately reused, which is huge. I mean, that's, you're getting close to zero impact, which is something that should be celebrated. But also wanted to switch over and talk about a different stone brewing company, because it is, not the most unique name in the entire world, in Richmond, Virginia, closer to home. And the reason I wanted to bring these guys up is because there's an increasing push, and I feel like knowledge of this is really variable depending on what part of the country you're in and who you're talking to. But increasingly, treatment plants are realizing that a lot of what breweries are outputting um, is something that they can actually use in their own wastewater treatment. So Richmond has started basically getting some of the effluent directly from Stone Brewing Company to use in their wastewater treatment. And it's basically allowing them to fight nitrification. So this is a situation where this byproduct, that stone is usually, would actually be a problem in a lot of places, is being sent directly to the local wastewater treatment facility as a methanol offset, which is huge. It means that, the thing that is a byproduct, a useless to you byproduct of, the production of beer, is now actually part of the wastewater treatment process. And increasingly, breweries across North Carolina, or not just North Carolina, the entire country, are starting to realize that in certain places, several of the byproducts of um, brewing can be utilized in different points in the wastewater, the wastewater treatment process. And I think what this stresses, and what I kind of want to end on here, is that at the end of the day, just having an open, honest dialogue between the brewery or breweries, depending on what town you're in, and their local water utility has enormous potential to pay dividends. Not only will you avoid stepping on each other's toes, in ways that can be potentially damaging to both. But ultimately, the symbiosis that you're seeing created by places like Stone Brewing Company is really possible and something that we really should be looking into as we move forward and try to get to basically a circular model of production. And with that, I am done and I can shut up for a second. Would you guys, I just want to leave a few minutes if anybody had any questions on the topic. I may be able to answer them. And if I can't answer them, I can get down your email and follow up with you.
Justin, what's the organization that you're with again?
I am with the UNC Environmental Finance Center. So obviously out of the School of Government, which has been on all the slides.
Yeah,
We
yeah,
we we are kind of a pocket organization within the School of Government. We are soft funded, which means that we work on a lot of different projects at any given time, but all of it deals with water and typically either uh, typically financial has a financial component. So some form of finding grant funding or finding, long-term loans or basically helping water utilities stay alive.
yeah. Okay. The reason I asked, I'm with Waste Reduction Partners,
Yeah.
and Sierra Nevada I recognize, and several other breweries we've done some work with. I didn't know how closely we might be talking to the same people for technological advice as well as from your side, financial advice.
Oh, it's entirely possible.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And feel free to reach out. I'll post my email in the chat.
Okay. Yeah, that's I was trying to set up a relationship. That'd be great.
Boom. Any other questions, comments, concerns?
Hey, Abigail with Sustainable Carolina. We're within the Institute for the Environment here.
Absolutely.
Um, have you had the opportunity to work with any like Orange County breweries yet?
Let's see. We worked with BMC Brewery, which
Okay.
I'm not sure if they're in Carborough, but I'm not sure if they're Orange County. They're off of Lorax Lane,
Okay.
which is a fantastic name for the road. Um, and we worked with a meadery that's actually on that same road. There's two different spots over there. Trying to think. We tried to stay spread out, so we've tried to work with kind of no concentrations. So I think those might be the only two we've worked in Orange County. Do you have recommendations? Because we have applied for a second round of P2 that's going to focus even more aggressively on water and chemical use. So we are looking for a new round of brewers to talk to.
Yeah, yeah. I don't have any recommendations, but I work during the spring semester. Well, we actually plan all year, but with the town of Chapel Hill on Creek Week. And I know they do a lot of like outreach events around Orange County. And they hosted like a celebration at River Brewing this past year. So I know that like if you were working with an Orange County brewery, they would probably be interested in partnering on some kind of like educational outreach type piece. So I was just curious and thinking about making that connection.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really, really, really good idea. Potentially even just because we could do something with Eno River themselves, and then we like to give breweries an opportunity to kind of show everybody what they're doing and kind of like strut their stuff and say like we're working on doing environmental stuff. We had a big panel, like a panel party gala event on campus with Trophy Brewing from Raleigh and Mad Mole from Wilmington and Tarboro from Franklin or Tarboro from Tarboro, duh, where they all came and talked to school of a lot of the students in administration, public administration, just
Cool.
because there's a nexus right between
Mhm.
sort of the people who are making the rules and the brewers who are ultimately dealing with the consequences of those rules.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. That sounds like a cool event. Will this session be available? I can send a link to the town of Chapel Hill people that I work with, maybe.
Absolutely. Like I said, we will publicize this on our YouTube channel, School of Government YouTube channel
Awesome.
within about a week.
Cool. Sounds great.
Well, if that is all for today, I will let you guys go a little bit early.